there's a lot of talk about gun control, and that's understandable, especially with regards to automatic rifles. Although I also understand why the people who are gun owners are afraid of allowing what they regard as one of their fundamental rights to be infringed upon. But it would certainly be useful if we stopped giving people who do this sort of thing $100 million worth of free publicity and all the notoriety they can manage. So, that's another way of thinking about controlling. How important do you believe the American right to bear arms and maintain militias? Is it equivalent to the right to free speech? Well, I don't think anything is equivalent to the right to free speech or the responsibility for free speech. How important do I believe that right is? Jesus, that's a tough question. My dad's a hunter. He has 200 rifles, something like that. They're all single shots because he believes in aiming carefully. The culture I come from, which is northwestern Canada, is a rural culture, a hunting culture. People take their guns seriously there, and it is definitely part of their lifestyle. I mean, my dad's hunted his whole life, and we ate wild meat almost all the time I was growing up. I think that the right to bear arms is one of the markers of a free society. I don't think it's reasonable that only the police and the army should be allowed to be dangerous. Having said that, well, I think I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I feel obligated in some sense to go farther, especially with regards to what happened in Las Vegas, but it seems to me that mostly what happens after these mass shootings is that the event gets absolutely politicized and people take their standard positions, and there's no moving either side, and that's too bad. But I think that it's unfortunate to use an event like the Las Vegas event or the Columbine shootings to make political capital, and I think that's usually what happens, and so I'm not going to do that. I think it's an important right. I believe that the individual should be allowed or even encouraged to be dangerous, but controlled, So along with that right is a responsibility, and I guess maybe you can share your thoughts on the Vegas shooting. Yeah. Well, what I would do is recommend the biblical lecture I did on Cain and Abel, I would say, because I think that that's a good summary of the state of mind that somebody has to be in order to do what was done at Las Vegas. So you have to be very, very embittered by life in order to do that sort of thing. And you have to be searching for revenge, I would say. And it's not, you might think, well, it's only revenge on other people because you've developed hatred for people, but it's deeper than that. It's not just hatred for people. I would say it's hatred for being itself, and the desire to take revenge on being for the outrage of the tragedy and suffering that's associated with being. And maybe the tragedy and suffering that's been part and parcel of your own life. And that makes you embittered, and then past embittered becomes outraged, and past outraged becomes, well, homicidal or even genocidal. And that's a terrible state of mind to be in. It's a hellish state. I believe that the best way to conceptualize the state of mind that someone has to be in order to do something like the Columbine shootings, for example, or what happened in Las Vegas, is that you're really, and you have to speak about it in religious languages, you're really out for revenge against God for the outrage of creation. That's what it looks like to me, and that's a state of mind that's truly hellish, and you can get there by brooding long enough. Now, it's also possible, I mean, this guy didn't have any previous history, criminal history or anything like that, and he's pretty old, so there's also the possibility of some kind of neurological pathology that might be characteristic of him, some degenerative neurological disease. There was a kid years ago at the University of Texas at Austin who climbed up on the tower there and shot a number of people with a high-powered rifle, and he had a fast-growing tumor on his hypothalamus and had reported like these being overcome with extreme feelings of rage, and so that's another possibility. But I would say the embitterment hypothesis is the strongest one. I would also say too, I noticed that Steven Pinker tweeted this today, is that one of the ways of controlling this sort of thing would be for the press to agree not for there to be a blanket agreement not to publicize the name or any other identity markers of the people who do the shooting, because there's also this really, what would you call it, arrogance. It's a kind of arrogance and pride, last-ditch arrogance and pride that is associated with the fantasies that drive this sort of behavior. And the fantasy is something like, well, after I do this, everyone will sure know who the hell I was, even though maybe I was ignored or unhappy when I was alive. After I'm dead, everybody's going to know who I was and what I did. And, so there's this underground desire for fame. I guess it's notoriety, but notoriety might be preferable to being ignored. And so, there's a lot of talk about gun control, and that's understandable, especially with regards to automatic rifles. Although I also understand why the people who are gun owners are afraid of allowing what they regard as one of their fundamental rights to be infringed upon. But it would certainly be useful if we stop giving people who do this sort of thing $100 million worth of free publicity and all the notoriety they can manage. So, that's another way of thinking about controlling it. So,
one of the things you'll see, if you're interested in this sort of thing, if you ever go read the writings of the Columbine killers, the teens, they're very interesting. They're very much worth reading, especially, I think it's Dylan Klebold, who was the more literate of the two. But he tells you exactly where he went after brooding and brooding and brooding on his isolation and segregation from mankind. So he's out there he's out there in a chaotic domain. And because he's tortured by that, his thoughts
that you can read off the brain that occurs before the person either moves their finger or, let's say, decides to move their finger, and that occurs quite a bit before the feeling of voluntarism or that voluntary act. And so that's been read by Benjamin Libet, who did the experiments, as indication that even the feeling of voluntary choice is determined. But I don't think that that's a very useful way of addressing the issue, because the issue of when you lift your finger up again is it requires pre-programming to disinhibit. Like, how to do this, right? You don't have to learn to do that. So you have a little automated circuit that does this sort of thing. All these finger movements and everything, you can see babies practicing them, and they develop automated circuitry that tends to be posterior left hemisphere in order to run those automated processes out. And what you're basically doing when you decide to do something that's a routine that you've already practiced, or made out of subroutines that you've already practiced, is disinhibiting them. And the degree to which you might regard that as free exactly is unclear, as are the temporal limitations. So I don't think that Libet's experiments demonstrate conclusively that there's no such thing as free will, even though there are action potentials that indicate that there is brain activity signaling even the onset of a voluntary choice early. Now, another thing that we might look at in relationship to that is, so we can look at it phenomenologically, and we could also look at it in relationship to how people treat one another. So phenomenologically, it seems clear that we have free choice, and it isn't obvious to me why we have consciousness if free choice isn't real, because consciousness looks to me like a mechanism that deals with potential before it's transformed into actuality, let's say. And I think consciousness is also the faculty, so to speak, or a manifestation of the faculty that enables us to pre-program deterministic actions. So again, let's think about someone playing the piano. They're practicing, after you repeat and you repeat your finger movements, if you're playing the piano, any complex motor skill is like that. You have to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And you're using consciousness to program it, to sequence the motor movements, and to pay attention to them. That all seems voluntary, and it involves the activation of a tremendous amount of your brain, because if you're doing something new, a lot of your brain is activated. And then as you practice it, the amount of brain that's activated decreases. It shifts from right to left, and then it shifts from frontal to posterior, and a smaller and smaller area. So what's happening is that consciousness is creating little machines in the back of your head that do things in an automated manner. And the consciousness looks like consciousness appears and feels, that would be the phenomenological end, as if it's doing that voluntarily, and it is associated with a different pattern of brain activity. And so, okay, so there's that. There's the phenomenological reality of voluntary choice and effort as well, because conscious programming of that sort is also effortful. It doesn't seem to run deterministically like a clock does. And then finally, there's also, and I don't know what you think about this with regards to evidence, but what constitutes evidence is not always that easy to determine, even in the scientific domain. So think about how we think about ourselves and other people, and how we treat ourselves and other people. You can imagine that you're like a clock running down, and that's like a deterministic model. But people aren't clocks. We're dissipative structures. A clock is something that runs downhill. But human beings, you can look up dissipative structure. I think that was an idea that was first formulated by the physicist Schrodinger. We're not clocks by any stretch of the imagination, and we take energy in and we disperse energy, and we're anti-entropic in a temporary sense. So that makes us, and life is as well. Schrodinger wrote about that in a book called What is Life? And what we seem to do, this is how it looks to me. We don't contend with the present, and we're not driven by the past. Instead, what we see in front of us is a landscape of possibility. And in my wilder moments, I think that's associated with the physical idea of multiple universes, but that's in my wilder moments. It's just a speculation. And so what we see in front of us is an array of potential universes. And those are the universes that we could bring about as a consequence of our actions.